I will be very brief, but it's a real pleasure to introduce not only a distinguished scholar, but a good and long personal friend. I met Brian Lynn 27 years ago on a softball field at Ohio State. I had been sent there as an Army captain to get a master's degree in history so I could go teach at West Point, which I was able to do. Brian was there doing his graduate work in military history. And we started a relationship of mutual respect, I hope, and continuous debate that has now lasted more than a quarter of a century. He had a beard, fairly long hair, a wonderful wife who remains his truly his better half, and who's with us in the back, and met most of my stereotypes of a civilian graduate student, and I met all, I'm certain, of his stereotypes of an Army officer and a company commander. And so we began this discussion of who's better, the military or the civilians. And Brian there was no end of his criticism of, the generals never got this right. Army officers didn't think this. And of course, I would counter always, well, have you ever been there, bud? Have you ever tried to make those decisions yourself? And this has been going on, chattering back and forth. Since then, of course, I've had a relatively modest military career and retired to run this wonderful institution. And Brian has become one of the foremost scholars of American military history practicing in the United States today, I'm very proud to say. He did his PhD at The Ohio State University. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Ohio. He has teaches now at Texas A&M University, but he has taught at the U.S. Army War College. He's had a number of fellowships. He has published widely, starting with an insightful history of the American participation in the Philippine insurrection in the wake of the Spanish-American War. And he has what I think will be a brilliant book forthcoming from Harvard University Press. But more than that, a consistent theme of our conference here has not just been the military history of the United States, but its relationship to the body politic, to the government, to our democracy, and to us as citizens. And Brian has served us. I tease him about not being a veteran, but it's good because all of us who are veterans are biased to some degree on account of it. Brian is one of those wonderful public servants who studies military institutions with great compassion and great sympathy and great insight without being of them. He is often very critical, but it is a criticism that is good for the armed forces. And in doing that and teaching other future citizens to do likewise, as many of you do in the work that you do, he performs an invaluable patriotic service. And so it is a great personal pleasure as well as a professional pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Lynn.
He told me he was going to do that. Well, the only story I'll tell you about Paul is that I saved his marriage. Well, two stories. One was I saved his marriage because I did. On a softball diamond, he had worn his wedding ring inside of his glove, and we spent the better part of 3 innings going around until I finally found the ring. So that's and the same thing as you said, I could lose my West Point ring, but I can't lose that one. And the second thing is, I remember during one of the many discussions we had at, I think it was Dick's Den, we were pretty faced by that time, and Ray and I decided that if all officers in the U.S. Army were as good as Paul, we would join. Which, for people coming out of the 60s, was an incredible concession. Fortunately, we knew they weren't, so we were safe having to enlist. But it was a nice sentiment, nevertheless. As usual, unconventional war is bringing up the rear behind the big popular wars of the Civil War and World War II. But at least we're now on the program. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even been on the program. And I think, it's easy to do here, especially at this wonderful museum. So I think we have to remember as teachers, it's not just our role to celebrate and memorialize, but now and then to bear witness to the truth. And sometimes this is relatively minor. I'd like to point out that the fellow on Pershing's left has been shrunk by about 8 inches to make him smaller than Pershing when he was in fact considerably taller. And then sometimes it's more serious, especially when we detail, as one of you pointed out, the conundrum that we're facing today. And military historians are being called upon to talk about this, and it's often making us very uncomfortable. Since President George W. Bush's declaration of the war, or the global war on terror, particularly since the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, what was once a small and isolated group of civilians and military specialists who wrote on unconventional war has increased into the thousands. There's dozens of books and articles and columns and blogs and op-eds which seek to use historical examples to provide insight on today's problems, that purport to provide historically informed guidance that is immediately applicable in today's operations environment. And I think for the non-specialist who's trying to integrate unconventional war into the classroom, the problem of separating the wheat from the chaff has increased exponentially. And some of today's writers are veterans who are bringing some very hard-won experience and expertise on the subject. But many are simply talking heads and pundits who have become instant authorities. And too often, far too often, they have brought to their analysis of unconventional war the same political partisanship, the same glib superficiality that characterized their discussion on the so-called revolution in military affairs prior to the global war on terror. And as a result, there's a great deal of chaff and relatively few kernels of wheat out there. So the question becomes, as teachers, how do we teach unconventional warfare? These are not the major wars that appeared on Professor McDougall's chart. Yet, arguably, they have achieved far more than many of the major wars we have fought. The survival of the Anglo-American colonies, not an inconsequential fact. The conquest of the trans-Mississippi West. The acquisition of a Pacific empire. U.S. hegemony over the Caribbean and until Mr. Chavez, some people argue into South America. These are not minor things. And these were not accomplished by the great wars. And I think we can do this 2 ways. And of course, the way the ideal way is, of course, is to incorporate unconventional war into every discussion that we have on war in American society. But the other way, and the way we're going to do it today because of the limited time, is to treat it as a discrete topic. And I'm going to try and talk about what I see as the outlines of perhaps an American way of unconventional war, if there is such a thing, and I'm not sure there is. My general thesis would be that from 1622 to the present, Americans have responded to unconventional war with a strategy, or strategies actually, of expediency, essentially adjusting tactics and methods to local conditions. Now, when Americans have had strategic and tactical leaders who are capable of innovation and adaptation, who are sensitive to the political and cultural dimensions of their area of operations, who are able to combine tactical excellence with a long-term strategic pacification program, they've done quite well. On the other hand, when Americans have had unimaginative leadership, commanders who are arrogant, who confuse tactics with strategy, who are culturally ignorant, they have not done well. And I think this is why so many attempts to talk about the American way of unconventional war have tended to focus on individual leaders or specific campaigns where it's possible to discuss these strategies of expediencies, these individual adaptations. And it's so much more hard to see it over the broad course of American history. But I would argue if there is a distinct American way of unconventional war, it has its origins in a long, long struggle between the Anglo-American colonists and the Native American inhabitants. And colonial American history is a very vibrant field. And there's much debate and very informed, very good debate on the cultural and racial and religious elements of this Anglo-Indian struggle. On the military side, there's a huge debate on whether the British colonists adapted Native American warfare or if they simply held to European ideals. And I think, as we often do, we've sort of decided to split the middle and occupy the middle ground, to argue that colonists tended to follow and practice when they could European-style warfare, particularly to seek a decisive battle. But when attempts to bring Native Americans to a decisive battle failed, and they usually did, because the enemy was far too smart to do this, usually, then colonists adapted. They employed rangers and Native American allies to conduct their own irregular war on the frontier. People like Benjamin Church and Robert Rogers would raise elite units of frontiersmen, and they'd fight a war of raids and ambushes and skirmishing. In addition to this, Western military organization and Western military logistics allowed the colonists to send large expeditions into their opponent's territory for brutal and destructive forays that targeted crops, houses, and non-combatants. These were actually known as food fights at times, or feed fights. By 1814, these methods had proven so successful that the Americans were essentially able to destroy the Creek Confederacy and Tecumseh's alliance, and probably with that, the last chance for Native Americans to hem in white expansion. Now, the regular army takes over the majority of the mission of suppressing Native American resistance after 1815, and it adopts many of these methods from the colonists, adding to them better European-derived tactics and discipline and weaponry and organization. It's not to say the Army didn't have its share of botched campaigns, atrocities, even the occasional massacre. Custer's Last Stand is still, I think, the most written about single military event in American history. But on the whole, the small, regular army proved more than adequate to fighting frontier unconventional war. Now, it did this by modifying its tactical organizations, modifying its transport to allow troops to subsist out in the wilderness, creating a disproportionately large cavalry force to try and have mobility to match their opponents, employing indigenous scouts like the infamous Crow scouts that Professor Maslowski is now studying. And they made a host of other improvisations. An experience, because these people were out there for many, many years. Experience taught them things like how to read the landscape for potential ambushes, how to make use of local intelligence sources, how to read from sign, for example, the composition of an enemy war band, how to communicate with Native Americans through sign language, for example. And also they learned, as their colonial predecessors had, the futility of trying to chase down highly mobile bands of warriors. And so they soon returned, as colonial soldiers had, to attacking the enemy society, to destroying foodstuffs and shelter, and subjecting non-combatants to exposure and starvation. One Secretary of War described this form of warfare in 1858, and I quote, as beating their forces, capturing many prisoners, destroying large amounts of property, and laying waste their country. Now, paradoxically, at the very time it fostered what might be seen as a climate of barbarism and savagery. The Army's emphasis on individuality and martial virtues, which were crucial to frontier survival, pointed also to morality. And so officers' character became seen as an essential component of unconventional warfare. And so officers might view Indian-white conflict as unavoidable. They might view the destruction of Native American culture as unavoidable. But once their opponents had ceased armed resistance, it was the government's ethical and moral responsibility to take care of the defeated foe. And so you have officers such as Nelson Miles, who prided themselves on their ability to defeat Native Americans, and yet publicly castigated not only their government, but their fellow officers for what they viewed as brutal and dishonorable conduct. I think a further legacy of unconventional war is that it taught American military officers that military operations do not end with a parade and a declaration of victory, and perhaps, had they had it, even a landing on an aircraft carrier. Okay? Military victory is ambiguous. Battles and campaigns do not terminate resistance. Occupation followed, and with it came usually a far longer and far more arduous and far more ambiguous pacification process. Now, these officers who served on the frontier in the 19th century produced no intellectual equivalent of Clausewitz, who provide them with a great theory of minor warfare. And they pass on their knowledge, such as it was, with a variety of official and unofficial measures. Official data or documents such as reports, and unofficial such as memoirs and letters and books. But to those assigned to this, the lessons are passed down in a piecemeal fashion. And it is very hard to establish a direct connection between Indian fighters from one generation to the next. But this is in part because frontier officers faced a variety of opponents. If you're facing the Sioux one year and the Apache the next, the tricks that got you by the Sioux will get you killed against the Apache. Okay, they had to constantly adapt and adjust. And the other thing is, I don't think they viewed the absence of written doctrine as critical, because they had such faith in their own leadership, in their tactics, in their units, in their weaponry. They probably even welcomed the absence of formal guidance. In a sense, they believed far more in themselves than they did in any outside guidance for how to do this. Now, the Civil War conjures up visions of epic battles such as Gettysburg, but as Professor Mark Grimsley has pointed out in his book, The Hard Hand of War, it was also an unconventional war. It was a very uncivil war in many respects. Faced with widespread violent resistance to federal authority, Union officers responded with a variety of measures. In some ways, these were much like they did on the frontier. For example, raising local defense forces, paramilitaries, if you want to call them, elite counterinsurgency units. Places like Missouri, they depopulated counties, just took out the residents and moved them out of the area. Using cavalry to launch long-range raids on suspected guerrilla hideouts. But as the war dragged on, and they became more and more convinced of the implacable hostility of the Southern population, they increasingly turned to destroying the economy and the society that supported that Confederacy. And so campaigns such as Sherman's March or Sheridan's raids into the Shenandoah are the most visible sign of hard war. And in doing that, you can say that the Army is in fact practicing a form of warfare much like it had practiced on the Western frontier, with a significant exception, which has great resonance today. One unique aspect of the Civil War was the problem of military occupation. And a military occupation of an area where the enemy army might have been destroyed, but where the civilian population violently resisted the imposition of United States authority. In 1863, the Union Army promulgated General Orders 100, the instructions for the government of armies in the field. And the instructions outline, if you want, a social contract between the occupier and the occupied. Soldiers, and this is one of the first cases of an army voluntarily accepting restrictions on its behavior in time of war. The Union Army made a contract, if you will, that its soldiers would behave honorably, that they would be disciplined, that they would not abuse the population. And this is important not just for internal discipline, but because the Army is a government agent. And as a government agent charged with imposing order, its behavior in the occupied areas cannot be disorderly. The Army cannot be a force of disorder, and General Orders 100 recognizes it. It has to become the government, the force of order. And so the Army is expected to provide law enforcement, to revive commerce, to interfere as little as possible with the lives and customs and institutions of the population. As Pete pointed out in 2003, it's supposed to protect museums and religious shrines. But the civilian population has to accept the conqueror's authority. That's where the contract comes in. Continued resistance to lawful government makes the population war traitors or war rebels. And to crush such opposition, to restore peace and order, the instructions legitimized what it called protective retribution, such as confiscating or destroying property, imprisonment, even execution. Now, implicit in the instructions is a recognition that the very nature of unconventional war, the problems of exercising command and control over large distances to widely dispersed units operating in the middle of a hostile, potentially violent population, means having to devolve responsibility to the officer on the ground. In other words, you might call it a strategy of expediency. That document, by the way, was adopted by the German Army in 1870, and you can make a sort of direct thing with that for the Hague Conventions and all the way up to the laws of war today. Now, the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898 we can see as a significant turning point, and in other ways a continuation of this way of war. Because the ensuing 15 years encompass not just the campaigns in Cuba and Puerto Rico in 1898, the Philippine Islands in 1899 to 1902, the so-called Philippine Insurrection or Philippine War, China, the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, but then you go another decade of pacification operations in the Philippines that actually last until 1913, Cuban occupation, 1906, 1909, and then various incursions into Mexico from about 1914 on. And as as on the Western frontier, soldiers face an even greater variety of opponents and even a greater variety of terrain. And they're given a multiplicity of missions, as they were on the Western frontier, ranging from the defeat of the enemy army to the imposition of a colonial government. And as on the frontier, they learn military victory on the battlefield does not end armed conflict. And this is especially true in the Philippines, where once a conventional war had ended in 1899 and the generals had proclaimed victory, the resistance that continues has no central ideology, central political institution. It is a localized resistance that's carried on by a combination of nationalists and bandits and religious groups and tribes and you name it. It's a society much like Colombia in the 1950s that's in the middle of a violencia. Individual American officers were separated from their regimental commands by jungles and water and mountains, operating almost entirely on their own, responsible not just for a company of 100 troops, but usually for thousands of Filipino civilians for whom it was their job to provide government, order, protection, restore the economy, and so forth. Now these wars sort of raised another question about the Army's role, which we've often forgot about. Was the Army's role simply to fight and win the nation's wars, as the institution sometimes self-defines itself, to fight and win the nation's wars? Or was it also expected to secure the results of war? Now, Colonel Robert Bullard, a veteran of these wars, told his colleagues, his fellow officers, "Our whole recent experience, our present duties, our future prospects, all point to the idea that by the study of war alone, we shall be but little prepared for by far the greater burdens which are to fall upon us, which are the making of peace." And Major General Leonard Wood, a very famous colonial warrior, agrees. Writing to a colleague in the Philippines, he writes, "I don't think we have any moral right to go into a country, discipline a lot of savage people, a process which is generally accompanied by a great loss of life, and then put indifferent people in charge of them and permit conditions to rise which render the repetition of the process necessary. It is wrong." But prolonged deployments, public criticism of troop conduct in the Philippines, and particularly the Army's perceived, and I think for a variety of reasons, view that the real threat was a great war against another European power, or later on Japan, all dampened enthusiasm for sustained unconventional war. And so, starting almost immediately after the end of the Philippine War in 1902, the Army shifts back to focusing on big war. And what it retains from these imperial wars are small guidelines, tiny little pamphlets, no theoretical understanding of unconventional war. In fact, prior to the Second World War, the Army school system's guidelines on unconventional war were a 3-page pamphlet that was plagiarized from the British. It didn't even have the American experience. We simply borrowed the Brits and stuck it in, and that's what the generation of Dwight D. Eisenhower studies for minor warfare. So if you take it up to World War II, this 150-odd years of unconventional war, you could argue that this is the Army's task, but seldom its calling. It's not to say they were ineffective on the frontier or on the Far East, nor to say that they weren't aware of the problem of fighting unconventional wars. Not just the adaptation of tactics, but also the problem of imposing peace once you had won the battles. And there's enormous literature in the primary documents on unconventional war. And it's everything from how to pack a mule, to how to conduct an ambush in the jungle, to how to search a village, to how to take apart a guerrilla infrastructure. But it is not ever codified into a formal doctrine. It remains piecemeal. It remains passed on by word of mouth. And with that goes a great deal of legend and misinformation and so forth. Well, this legacy, if you will, this colonial U.S. Army legacy of unconventional war, I would argue is shattered in the Cold War. Because fixated on the threat posed by the Soviets in Europe, American officers initially studied unconventional war only as a way to weaken the Red Army. And it's often forgot, but in the late 1940s, we actually study unconventional war because we think we can do it to the Soviets. We don't see it as a threat to ourselves. However, in the 50s, with the rise of wars of national liberation, the anti-colonial movement, then Americans begin to study it as a threat, not as an opportunity. And then they begin to study their own experience in Korea, especially the British experience in Malaysia, French wars in Indochina and Algeria. They study these, but they do not study their own heritage of unconventional war. Even officers serving the Philippines in the 1950s remain convinced that the emergence of communist revolutionary warfare renders all previous methods of unconventional warfare essentially obsolete. There's no clear evidence that the advisors who were advising President Magsaysay against the Hukbalahap guerrillas in the Philippines in the 1950s even knew of their army's counterinsurgency past. What they did was study what the British were doing in Malaya and what they thought had happened in World War II. Well, time doesn't permit an extended discussion on the conduct of the Vietnam War, and I really think for our purposes, it's more important to talk about its intellectual legacy for unconventional war. But suffice it to say that Vietnam created such bitterness that for over a decade, and I would say for much longer than a decade, the Army as an institution all but rejected it out of hand. And in the process, it rejected any possibility that unconventional war might ever be its future mission. Even as the last units are leaving Vietnam, the Army had already adapted what you might call a quasi-official mythology to explain the defeat. And this mythology essentially said that Army tactics had succeeded precisely because they had used conventional forces, firepower, and technology. And because the Army had won, there was no reason to study unconventional war. Okay? If there was going to be a study of it, it would be delegated to advisors, to indigenous units aided perhaps by the special forces. But the Army itself had nothing to learn from it. And in 1981, Colonel Harry G. Summers published On Strategy, the Vietnam War in Context, which I wouldn't say now, but for decades became the closest thing to an official Army interpretation of the war. It still exerts a profound influence on Army thinking both about Vietnam and unconventional warfare. And Summers emphasized the success of the Army. In fact, Summers is perhaps the basis of the claim that you've no doubt heard. We won every battle. We were never defeated in the field. But, according to Summers, such tactical success could not overcome a faulty strategy imposed by incompetent civilian leaders. So that instead of waging the war we should have fought, a conventional war against North Vietnam, we had got sidetracked into a counterinsurgency campaign against the Viet Cong. And this failure to attack the true center of gravity had led to a stalemate, ultimately to a failure of American popular will, and with that, the war was lost. And I think with some variations, this argument that the war was won in the field and lost at home continues to resonate within many people in the Army. So that, given this interpretation, it's not surprising that the post-Vietnam Army turns its attention back to big unit conventional war. And the wisdom of this, by the way, is allegedly demonstrated in what you might call the certain victory of the Gulf War of 1991. And it's interesting to see, in a way, how this this transition, from this betrayal in Vietnam to vindication in the Gulf War is sort of interpreted as a heroic allegory. In fact, to quote the title of one laudatory account, this is an epic of how the generation of officers born of Vietnam revolutionized the American style of war. Revolutionized the American style of war. Now, however chauvinistic this claim, it's very crucial to note that this revolution in the American style is inspired by and directed at a very traditional goal. That is, the defeat of the Warsaw Pact in a large land war in the middle of Central Europe. And in the meantime, during this period, unconventional war falls into the darkness. I mean, one of the best ways to look at that, to get back to rhetoric, is to look at the terms that were applied to unconventional war from the 1970s up to the global war on terror. In the 1970s, it was IDAD, Internal Defense and Development. And in the 1980s, this morphed into LIC, for low-intensity conflict. And then in the 1990s, it became MUTWA, for military operations other than war. And what I find even more interesting, as you want to get into the subtext of this, is the very qualities that had characterized American unconventional war, if you will, flexibility and initiative and decentralized leadership and aggressiveness, are now claimed as the distinct attributes of American big unit war. And I think this then affected things like military procurement, so that almost all the Army's budget that's done to procurement is towards big war. Abrams tank, the Bradley, the Apache, the Black Hawk. These were all designed to fight on the European battlefield. Another way of looking at this is to look at professional military education during this period. And these are the people, by the way, who went through the school system, who are now, in many ways, commanding at the senior levels in Iraq. In the 1970s, the Field Artillery School, the Armor School, and the first iteration of the Infantry School had no instruction at all on unconventional war. If you look at the overview of the United States Army's Command and General Staff College and go through the curriculum papers, as educators, what are they teaching? Look at the curriculum. From 1976 until the Gulf War, 90% of the instruction is devoted to big unit warfare. And what was called low-intensity conflict, a typical year like 1982, 1983, out of a total of 500 hours of instruction, low-intensity conflict gets 23. And this fixation continues all the way into the 1990s, long after the collapse of the Soviet Union should have made it, in retrospect, manifestly evident that the possibility of fighting a big unit war in Central Europe was growing increasingly improbable. But in 1993, as I recall, the Leavenworth exercise, the big war game, is to fight the Soviet Union, a reconstituted Soviet Union, because by this time it had broken up, but somehow it morphs back and launches an attack right down the Fulda Gap, just like it was supposed to do in 1986, and bam, we're back to fighting this big unit war. Or if you read what's called the Prairie Warrior exercises, it's how to fight in Central Europe against another army full of tanks and so forth. So I would argue that in retrospect, this revolution in the American style of warfare is very much an attempt to restore a big unit war at the cost of everything else. Now, what's ironic is during this period, the Army actually is committed into combat. And it's committed into combat into largely what you might think of as unconventional wars. But these are so easy that they don't really teach anything. In fact, they might even teach the wrong lesson. They might teach people that these wars are so easy they don't require any theory or practice or art. Intervention in Grenada in 1983, for example, which was widely hailed as demonstrating the Army's rebirth after Vietnam, in retrospect was seen as overwhelming application of power against a second-rate opponent. Panama, another great case study, which revealed significant problems. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, as historians have the luxury of doing, it's possible to see along this path officers who stood up and had warning signs and said, this focus on big unit war is becoming dangerous. We need to stop this. We need to look. And I think in the inevitable post-mortem after Iraq, we're going to look back and find a small group of officers and give them the same reverence we now give to the architects of the Desert Storm campaign, like we give Colin Powell or Norman Schwarzkopf. And I think one of these characters is going to be General John Galvin, who in 1986, he scolds the Army for what he calls its comfortable vision of war, one that fits our plans, our assumptions, our preconceived ideas. He says the future belongs to uncomfortable wars. These are wars that are not on a restricted battlefield. And Galvin says, war is no longer simply fought by the military. It now encompasses entire populations. Its outcome depends on collective will. Future wars, he predicts, are going to see the blurring of combatants and non-combatants, the growth of ideology, and the influence of civilian combatants on the nature of war. All three of these predictions were borne out in Iraq. Unfortunately, Galvin's warnings went largely unheeded. I think instead, many people interpreted the Gulf War as vindicating the Army's approach since Vietnam. And in fact, faced with the drastic Cold War reduction of forces, the Army essentially chose to keep its Cold War structure. Half its divisions were going to be armor or mechanized. And the signs of significant problems were conveniently ignored. Somalia, remember that? That was interpreted as showing that Colin Powell was right, that we should never go into war that we couldn't win quickly and decisively. With even more hubris, one of my favorite characters, General Wesley Clark, the former presidential candidate, who ran largely on his military expertise. Well, this is Clark on the Kosovo operation. This demonstrates modern war, working, limited, carefully constrained in geography, scope, weapons, and effects. Well, no, it turned out that Kosovo was an anomaly. That's not modern war. But at the time, that's how it was perceived. But I think if you really want to get into Babel speak, you have to look at Army Vision 2010, released barely, as I recall, a year before the global war on terror. And it really gives you great insight into the Army's vision of what war is going to be like in the near future. Army Vision 2010 introduced concepts, and by the way, you can Google this and pull it down, concepts such as mass effects and dominant maneuver, precision engagement, full dimensional protection, asymmetric leverage. And it declares with absolute assurance, and don't attempt to understand this, just enjoy it. Modern technologies will exploit situational understanding phenomena to enable tailored, still undefined combat organizations to task organize quickly and fight dispersed with extraordinary ferocity and synchronization. Fused inputs from manned and unmanned sensors will provide unprecedented battlefield situational understanding in depths well beyond the horizon. Significant advances in avionics and weaponry and vehicle mobility and stealth and survivability and communications technology will make the land force truly the force of decision on the 21st century battlefield. I think it's hard to imagine a vision of war that's less relevant to what's going on now in Iraq. But that was the Army's vision. And so I would say that the Army entered the war in Iraq very well prepared to fight the Soviet Union, or a deteriorating Soviet surrogate, and perhaps in 10 years to fight the sort of Star Wars vision that it had of Vision 2010. But it was not prepared for unconventional warfare, and it is not, that lack of preparation cannot be laid entirely at the feet of the people who I think are most responsible, President George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld. Okay. Believing that it had truly revolutionized the way the American Army conducted war, the Army sought a comfortable vision of war and was then shocked when events span out of control. Now today in Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly at the company and field and the battalion and the brigade now, and I would even argue in the division level, they have once again learned the traditional American way of unconventional war, the strategy of expediency. You know, the methods that they're using, you know, adapting tactical formations to the terrain and improvising logistical organizations, forming special intelligence and reconnaissance units, recruiting indigenous guides, using a whole host of pacification techniques, not just military, but trying to establish schools and government and water supply and so forth. These are all things that would have been familiar to those who fought on the Western frontier and to those out on the empire in the early 20th century. What I find ironic is that these are being hailed as proof of the soundness of pre-war Army doctrine. And in fact, what they are is a deliberate rejection of that. And so I think the Army's experience in Iraq now then demonstrates something to get back to the importance of teaching this. It is important to understand America's heritage of unconventional warfare, because an army and a society that turns its back on that heritage and seeks to impose its own comfortable vision of war on the rest of the world is going to pay a very large price for such hubris. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We have time for some questions.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I spent 17 years in Special Operations Forces out of a career of over 22
Speak into the
years.
microphone.
And I can tell you that the regular Army has always spurned Special Forces. And the reason is that the Special Forces has always attracted the highest quality people that you can possibly come by. These are the people that think outside the box. They're not conventional folks at all. It wasn't until about 79 or 80 when Special Forces actually became an organized branch of the Army. Up until that time, if you were an infantry officer and you volunteered for another tour in Special Forces, you were told that's the end of your career. We have made great strides. The operation in the rescue mission in Iran spurred on the creation of the Joint Special Operations Force. Ever since then, we have made really, really big strides. We do unconventional warfare real well. The problem is you will not hear about many of the things that we do right. You may hear about some of the things that don't go right, but those things that do go right impact greatly on national security.
No, I'll agree with you on that. I'll do 2 points. One of them is specifically the lessons of Vietnam. The Special Forces were cut drastically into groups. As you say, it was career suicide to do that. There was talk about cutting, even removing the school. And people who went into it, you know, were special tracked. And in a way, not until the creation of Special Operations Command did they sort of have their own promotion and, you know, where they were protected, if you will. Now, I'm not denying that in terms of commando-type operations, Americans have tremendous capability. But as an institution, I would argue that not until the Gulf War did the Army itself sort of address the unconventional warfare heritage. Okay? And again, one of the problems as a historian is you guys keep everything secret. If you want your story to be told by academic historians, you've got to start opening up your papers and not simply, you know, letting people like Ron Machaco and so forth tell, you know, Lurp Patrol number 9. You know, it's not, you know, you guys are victims of your own code of secrecy. So if you want historians to tell your story.
It needs to be that way.
Yeah.
Because of
Okay.
what we do.
Okay, I'm not denying it, but then it's very hard then to do anything except bar talk, because that's all we've got to work with. You know, yeah.
I have a couple of comments and then a question for you. The first comment is that a recent documentary by Nova called Battle Plan Under Fire, I think, does a great job of illustrating the successes, but also the challenges of the so-called revolution in military affairs and the kind of great scenario it sets up for the Army to win big unit battles, but when it runs into an unconventional opponent, when things break down, things can go horribly wrong for them. Again, if you go to pbs.org and search their shop, it's part of the NOVA series. It's called Battle Plan Under Fire, and it's just over a year old, and so I recommend it highly as a resource for educators. Another resource that's out there is a report that was broadcast last year on National Public Radio about the responses of junior officers in the field in Iraq and Afghanistan, precisely because at the highest levels they aren't getting training and support about how to deal with low-intensity conflict. They've used the internet to turn to each other. They email each other, they create blogs, and the military has finally been supporting them and giving them secure servers where a young infantry officer in Iraq can say, you know, I'm having this kind of problem on patrol. For you guys who have been out there, you know, what have you done? What has worked? And I think, again, it represents maybe a flashback to that sense of, I'm out here on my own. You know, Captain Kirk is in command of the Enterprise. Starfleet Command is a long way away. I've got to figure out a way to do this myself. I turn to my comrades and we work together to solve this kind of problem. My question to you is that do you think with the focus on big unit battles in the context of the Cold War that maybe the Army as an institution is waiting for a Malayan emergency situation as kind of a perfect storm for counterinsurgency operations, so before they would engage in that kind of scenario, with the understanding that you have to have very clear political objectives, you have to have a very clear socioeconomic setting that you can operate in where it's very easy to draw lines, and then it's very easier then to undertake not only military action against clearly definable enemy combatants, but also socioeconomic and political action behind the scenes or behind the lines, so to speak, and they're kind of waiting for one of those scenarios before they say, okay, we're going to make this at least a public, an overt branch of our...
The late Donald Rumsfeld said, you know, you sort of go with the war you've got. I would not, you know, there has been some of the best authorities on unconventional war are in uniform. You know, John Nagel being an excellent example of that. Tex Ham, you know, former Marine officer. I'm not attempting to denigrate the intellectual contribution of people in uniform. They've done an enormous amount, and it would be impossible to do this without their sort of guidance. On the other hand, institutionally, you know, and as a historian, you have to go to the documents. When you go to the curriculum, you don't find this hypothetical Malayan campaign. In fact, what you find is exactly the opposite. You find a Middle Eastern scenario that starts as a small insurgency, or and then within a week or two, the 82nd Airborne is committed, and it's then a corps, and then it builds up very quickly. I was at the War College. That's what we did. We did a whole exercise on that, and within about 3 days, this minor insurgency had spread into needing a corps, and we spent all our time trying to squeeze in extra units. And that was our exercise. That was in 1999. Okay? That's the war that the students were preparing to fight. We had virtually nothing, and I was teaching this, so I know this, on unconventional war. Paul can talk at some level about what he saw at the National War College, but it just wasn't a lot of that.
I wanted to follow up on the earlier question. I guess I'm getting confused at this point because we have a military presence in some 120 countries right now, and from Nepal to Ecuador. And while we don't know all the secrets of all the missions, we do know roughly what's going on in many of them, and we can certainly measure in terms of the situation on the ground or in the governments in those countries, whether we've been effective or ineffective. So I'm a little confused because the overall image you're giving is that you seem overall clueless, and yet, so many missions are apparently going effectively in a very unconventional sense.
Well,
Iraq stands out as more the gross exception.
Well, okay, I think two things. I didn't think they were clueless. I said they did very well at preparing to fight a European-style war. They got ideal technology. And I don't know if you can make this direct cause and effect, but certainly the Army would claim that one of the reasons the Soviet Union eventually gave up was the fact that that force in Western Europe was getting better and better and better, and that eventually the final card that the Soviet Union had, which was that to sweep into Paris and to sweep down the Channel, was no longer a possibility. And I would argue that's true. And I have no reason to doubt when the Army officers who had been very pessimistic in the 70s start writing about 86 or 87, we can take these Soviets. If they come, we can do it. I believe them. What I am saying is that comes at a price. It's an institution. It's the same like Ford Motor Company deciding to build nothing but SUVs. It might build really good SUVs, but if there's a gas crisis, suddenly this doesn't look like such a wise idea. I'd say that you had a very exclusive thing. Now, as far as the 100 troops, I mean, that's a sort of a deterrent argument, and it's sort of like arguing right now that, oh, President Bush solved terrorism because we haven't had another 9/11. You can't, you don't know if these people are effective or not. Okay, they're out there. In the Philippines, they seem to have done very well, okay, because that's become quite quiet, but I think the Philippine Army has also done quite well. It's adjusting really well. I don't think Nepal is a great success case, I don't think if it was that effective that we would be as disliked as we are. And remember, many of those 100 countries that we've got places, we've got military officers who are not particularly friends with us. If we were that strong, we would have a much larger coalition of the willing. So I think that argument that, we must be doing something right, I could argue just as easily we're doing something wrong, and I don't think the evidence is strong one way or the other. Oh, yes, sir.
I was wondering what your analysis would be on between the Army and Marine Corps, because it seems in terms of publications and study and books and so forth that they've done a lot more analysis of past experiences in terms of their writings and manuals and so forth, in terms of, this is unconventional warfare, this is how to approach it, this is what worked for us in the past, this is much to a greater extent than that of the Army.
Well, I'd actually have to disagree with you. I mean, I think the Marines are very good at going back and rediscovering their past and reinventing it. And then saying, see, we were always like, the Marines have never given up a mission. I mean, they're still on ships, allegedly to protect ships' captains against their crews, which I don't think in the modern Navy is really, that important a mission, but they're still there, and they're still doing all sorts of stuff that they did because they'll never give anything up, The idea that the Marines always say was, we had our Small Wars Manual. You know when the Small Wars Manual was written and published? Published in 1939, It's published at the end of the Banana Wars. I mean, the Banana Wars have been over 10 years when the Marines finally put their doctrine together. The idea that they had this, there's no evidence that they used it in Vietnam. They referred to it. They said we had this doctrine. There's no evidence that, the guys up in I Corps are taking out Small Wars Manual and doing it. I mean, and then the Marines published it later on in the 1980s. The Small Wars Manual was not republished during Vietnam. It's republished in the 1980s when the Marines want to beat up the Army for what happened in Vietnam. And then they claim, oh, see, we had another solution. We, these cap teams and, pacification. We were doing the right thing and the Army wouldn't let them. I don't think, and I like the Marines, because Marines were my friends when no one else wanted to listen to me. And I do not think I've met a finer group of people than the Marine majors I routinely teach. But you have to understand with the Marines is that they do create a lot of mythology. And they do like to go back and reinvent their past and claim that they did all this stuff. And when you go back and look at it, I mean, one of their claims is, we were always the counterinsurgency force. They were awful at counterinsurgency. You look at them in the Philippines, they're a disaster. And in the Boxer Rebellion, they're not very good. So, they create this myth and then they go back and find reasons to, believe it. But it's not historically true. It's a good story. It's just not happened to be true. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Do you have a plan or kind of a proposal for what steps need to be taken? First of all, to create a curriculum that would be suitable for teaching, and secondly, to really help the military decide how to try to access public funds, because in all honesty, they're going to be in competition with the more attractive, conventional, technological area. How do you go about creating that kind of situation where this can actually occur?
Okay, in answer to your second question, I'm not sure that's true. I think the one thing the American public might have learned from Iraq is you need ground forces, and that the Air Force can't deliver. When it says it can fight these neat, clean, surgical, but maybe I'm misunderstanding the great American public, but I just think that that's a legend and no one can really believe it. And I think the same thing's true of the Navy. That ultimately, as we learned in Iraq, you need troops on the ground. You need a whole lot more than we've got. And you can't deny that reality. Now, you can do the Colin Powell route and say, well, let's never go. But if you're going to fight, you need an army. And I would say right now the Army is the most important service. And I think that will continue. I know that's not the normal position. My friends in the green are all in doom and gloom. Now, to answer your question, one of the things the Army's done, it is an adaptable institution, is if you look at its latest book, which is now you can actually online. It used to be the Matloff Blue Book, but it's a new Army history. They are incorporating a lot more unconventional war. Okay, again, Pete Maslowski and Alan Millett's book, For the Common Defense, incorporates that part of American military heritage into it. Okay, West Point now has a class on Revolutionary War. I mean, they are adapting. My argument is not that they're not. I think they're adapting amazingly fast. And I don't think the problems now are at the military level. But so they have learned. My argument would be, however, is that in the wake of Vietnam, there was almost a deliberate effort to close that door, to not study unconventional war, and so that you do wind up in the first year with generals who, on the whole, could have gone through their entire career without ever taking a class in low-intensity conflict. And I think I would argue that much of the problems in the first year when Sanchez and Tommy Franks are sort of stumbling around is because these people had never studied it. They didn't know what the situation was. Now, that's not true of the people nowadays. They're far more astute. But I do think you can make, if not a direct cause and effect, certainly a problem with a perception of war that existed in 2003 that did not conform to what they found in Iraq, and as a result, a great deal of difficulty in adjusting. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Do you see the role of the historian / especially in the military area, one of correct assessment of a former military conflict and let the chips fall where they may? Because what it seems that you're saying is that the failure to do that with Vietnam really shaped everything that came after that to our detriment.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I really do. And I think, let me tell you, I've got more support within the service in many ways than I've got from civilian audiences. So yeah, but I think you have to witness the truth, because the danger is otherwise you will convince yourself that you've revolutionized war when all you've done is knock off Iraq in a 4-day war. That's the danger.
Thank you, Professor Lynn. I'm afraid the moment has arrived when we have to bring this to a close. I should mention that when we began planning this program about a year ago, the director of our military program, Mike Noonan, composed an agenda of speakers and topics for a program on teaching world military history. We contacted the McCormick Tribune Foundation about supporting such an enterprise, and they were very interested, but they expressed an interest in talking about teaching American military history. So Michael went back to work and put down an agenda for speakers on American military history. The only problem was it was so long that it would take 2 weekends to put it together. And in order to scale it down, we decided to, instead of going war by war, look at various themes, at Walter McDougall's suggestion. And by that time, Mike Noonan, who was a captain in the U.S. Army Reserves, was called up for service and has ever since been in Iraq, where he remains today. And so we called upon another fellow, Frank Hoffman, who put together a revised program which pretty much resembles what you've experienced this weekend, with some modifications along the way. So I wanted to thank those two who are not with us here today, Mike Noonan and Frank Hoffman, for helping us put together this conference. And as we learned yesterday, strategy, as I said, quoting one of my colleagues, strategy anyone can do, logistics that takes a genius. I'd like to thank my wife, Jan Luxemburg, who was responsible for a lot of the logistical planning for this weekend. I should also thank our videographer that goes by an unusual name, not totally appropriate to this, called Primitive World Productions, and the webcast group as well as all the technical people and staff here at the 1st Division Museum, which have really made this program run so smoothly. And I thank, of course, especially Paul Herbert, my partner in all of this, and very glad to have worked with you today. I'm afraid we've done our work. Now it's up to you. We have put together, I think, a spectacular roster of speakers. We hope we've stimulated your own thinking, and we hope that you will now take that into your classroom in the ways that only you can imagine that we cannot. And then let us know in the coming weeks how you hope to use the material you've incorporated in this weekend, so that we can report to those who support us, this is what's happening in the classroom. This is how this program has affected and changed the classrooms around the country. So you have evaluation forms in your packets. We hope to get those back either today or in coming weeks. But more important, we hope to hear from you about your curriculum that you may devise in response to this weekend, or your in-service presentations that you'll be giving in response to this weekend, because all that is very useful to us, and also we like to see that we did this, and now we want to know what the ultimate result was. And that is in your hands. We thank all our speakers, and we thank all of you for coming and joining us today. And now I turn it over to Paul Herbert.
Well, let me just real briefly echo Alan's remarks. First of all, it's been a pleasure and a privilege to partner with the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and if it had not been for all of the intellectual capital and logistic effort that they put into making this conference happen, it wouldn't have happened. So it was a pleasure to partner with them. I'd like to include my thanks to all the folks, many of whom you don't see in here, who are making this happen from both institutions, the technical folks, the administrative folks. There's an awful lot of work. I know all of you know that, and we certainly appreciate that. I really appreciate and thank every one of our speakers. We have had just a tremendous set of presentations at dinner last night and yesterday and today, and each one of you have enriched me personally, but I know all of the attendees, and we certainly appreciate that. There is one last group of people. It has nothing to do with the conference, but at our previous break, I set a little tiny pin with an American flag on it by some of your places. If you have one of those pins, stand up. These are our colleagues who at one time or another in their lives accepted the responsibility of serving our country in uniform and put their life between us and whatever else may have come our way, and I think we owe them our appreciation, and that's what the pin is for.